welcome to another broadcast of Comics Let's Talk. I'm Kevin Given. If you love comic books, you're going to subscribe to my channel. Just hit that little red subscribe button. We'll get different shows for you every week, or sometimes bi-weekly depending on my schedule. We'll have at least 2 or 3 shows a month for you, and we'll be talking about comic books and all things comic book related. This week on Comics Let's Talk, in lieu of the new Amazon Prime TV series, we're going to look at the history of Conan the Barbarian in the world of comic books. Plus, we'll briefly touch on the character's history and other media appearances. And my co-host, April Childers, could not be with us today. She's real busy today, has a lot to do, but we won't go into that. She's doing her thing and can't be here, that's all we need to know. Let's talk about the creator of Conan. Robert Irvin Howard was an American author who wrote pulp fiction in a diverse range of genres. He is regarded as the father of the Sword and Sorcery subgenre. Howard was born and raised in Texas. He spent most of his life in the town of Cross Plains, with some time spent in nearby Brownwood. A bookish and intellectual child, he was also a fan of boxing and spent some time in his late teens bodybuilding, eventually taking up amateur boxing. From the age of 9, he dreamed of becoming a writer of adventure fiction, but did not have real success until he was 23. Thereafter, until his death by suicide at age 30, Howard's writings were published in a wide selection of magazines, journals, and newspapers, and he became proficient in several subgenres. His greatest success occurred after his death. Although a Conan novel was nearly published in 1934, Howard's stories were never collected during his lifetime. The main outlet for his stories was Weird Tales, where Howard created Conan the Barbarian. With Conan and other heroes, Howard helped fashion the genre now known of as Sword and Sorcery, spawning many imitators and giving him a large influence in the fantasy field. Howard remains a highly read author, with his best works still reprinted. Howard's suicide and the circumstances surrounding it have led to speculation about his mental health. His mother had been ill with tuberculosis his entire life, and upon learning she had entered a coma from which she was not expected to wake, he walked out to his car and took his own life with a .380 Colt automatic. From the age of 9, he began writing stories, mostly tales of historical fiction centering on Vikings, Arabs, battles, and bloodshed. One by one, he discovered the authors who would influence his later work: Jack London and his stories of reincarnation and past lives, most notably The Star Rover from 1915. Rudyard Kipling's Tales of Subcontinent Adventure and his chanting shamanic verse. The classic mythology tales collected by Thomas Bulfinch. Howard was considered by friends to be eidetic and astounded them with his ability to memorize lengthy reams of poems with ease after 1 or 2 readings. After years of rejection slips and near acceptances, he finally sold a short caveman tale titled Spear and Fang, which netted him the sum of $16 and introduced him to the readers of a struggling pulp called Weird Tales. In May 1927, he returned to writing, including a rewrite of The Shadow Kingdom. He rewrote it again in August and submitted it to Weird Tales in September. The story was an experiment with the entire concept of the weird tale horror fiction as defined by practitioners like Edgar Allan Poe, A. Merritt, and H.P. Lovecraft, mixing elements of fantasy, horror, and mythology with historical romance, action, and swordplay into thematic vehicles never before seen. A new style of tale which ultimately became known as Sword and Sorcery, featuring Kull, a barbarian precursor to Howard's later heroes such as Conan. The tale hit Weird Tales in August 1929 and received fanfare from readers. Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright brought the story for $100, the most Howard had earned for a story at this time, and several more Kull stories followed. However, all but 2 were rejected, convincing Howard not to continue the series. In March 1928, Howard salvaged and resubmitted to Weird Tales a story rejected by the more popular pulp Argosy, and the result was Red Shadows, the first of many stories featuring the vengeful Puritan swashbuckler Solomon Kane. Appearing in the August 1928 issue of Weird Tales, the character was a big hit with readers, and this was the first of Howard's characters to sustain a series in print beyond just 2 stories. 7 Kane stories were printed in the 1928 to 1932 period. As the magazine published the Solomon Kane tale before Kull, this could be considered the first published example of Sword and Sorcery. Early 1932 saw Howard taking one of his frequent trips around Texas. He traveled through the southern part of the state with his main occupation being, in his own words, the wholesale consumption of tortillas, enchiladas, and cheap Spanish wine. In Fredericksburg, while overlooking sullen hills through a misty grain, he conceived of the fantasy land of Samaria, a bitter, hard northern region home to fearsome barbarians. In February, While in mission, he wrote the poem Cimmeria. It was also during this trip that Howard first conceived of the character of Conan. Later in 1935, Howard claimed in a letter to Clark Ashton Smith that Conan simply grew up in my mind a few years ago when I was stopping in a little border town on the lower Rio Grande. However, the character actually took 9 months to develop. Conan the Barbarian is a fictional hero who originated in pulp fiction magazines and has since been adapted to books, comics, several films, including Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer, television programs, both cartoon and live action, also video games, role-playing games, and other media. First comic book adaptation of a Howard Conan story was the feature La Reina de la Costa Negra, taken from the original Conan story Queen of the Black Coast, in the miniature-sized Mexican anthology titled Suentes de Abuelito, number 8, 1952, published by Corporación Editorial Mexicana, although Conan for some reason was blonde in this comic book. Almost 20 years later, he was introduced to the Marvel Universe in 1970 with Conan the Barbarian, written by Roy Thomas, illustrated by Barry Smith, and published by Marvel Comics. Marvel's associate editor at this time, Thomas, had obtained the licensed property from the estate of creator Robert E. Howard after finding Conan chief among readers' requests for literary properties to be adapted to comics, which also included the pulp magazine character Doc Savage, the Lord of the Rings of writer J.R.R. Tolkien and Edgar Rice Burroughs characters Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. I put together a memo for publisher Martin Goodman saying why we should license the character.
In the late 60s, there were a lot of things that were happening that made Stan Lee and myself as his more as assistant editor, associate editor, whatever title I had that week, decide we should branch out a little bit. More than just superheroes. You know, we were losing some things, the westerns and the models and so forth. That was okay, but we wanted to branch out into some other fields. This was probably an interest of mine even more than Stan's. I love the superheroes, but I wanted to see other things done. But I wasn't really familiar with Conan too much. I had bought the first copy off the newsstand because of the Frank Frazetta cover, just as I bought the Kull book also by Robert E. Howard because of Roy Krenkel, because these were two artists that I knew and respected. But I started reading the Conan book, and I thought it was going to be something like John Carter of Mars, which I was familiar with because it talked about Atlantis and all that, you know. So I thought it was going to be, you know, ray guns and stuff like that. I didn't really get into Conan. I read the first few pages, and he just comes in and he drags. It was the People of the Black Circle stories in that very first Conan the Adventure paperback with the archetypical Frank Frazetta cover of Conan with the girl wrapped around his leg, and he's on top of the hill of bodies and skeletons and so forth. And so I put it aside after reading it because he just comes in and he throws this girl over his shoulder and takes off with her. It didn't seem to have the elements of fantasy I was looking for, at least in the first 5 pages. I didn't give it much chance. And so I put it aside and didn't pay attention to it for a year or two. But in the meantime, Stan and I were getting a lot of letters. Well, Stan was getting letters, I was getting to read them. And saying, why don't you guys do things like Tolkien, which we looked into, and they said wasn't available at the time. Doc Savage, which we eventually did, and were looking at the time. Burroughs, which we looked into, and eventually several years later they did do for a couple of years, although some of the stuff was done, of course, by DC earlier. And also Conan, you know, and at least I knew what that was, Conan and Kull in a very vague sense. But we didn't figure we could afford Conan, so we were going to get something else. We were going to get Thongar by Lynn Carter, which was sort of half John Carter, half Conan imitation that I saw, and I liked the cover to one of the books that Frazetta also did. In fact, one of them of Thongar riding a pterodactyl. I bought the original oil of and owned for several years after that. And then somehow things got stalled in getting the rights to Thongar. Stan thought that was a better name than Conan anyway, you know. So one day I just read for maybe the first time the introductions that were printed by L. Sprague de Camp in the opening in the first few pages of all the Conan books. It would talk about who Conan was and who Robert E. Howard was. And at the end, it would mention this Howard Collector fan magazine that was put out by Glenn Lord, the literary agent for the Robert E. Howard estate. Now, other people might look at something else. The first thing I saw was literary agent. Now, that meant he must have some rights there that maybe he was someone we could approach. We knew that we weren't going to be able to approach DeCamp because he was a book author, and he was going to want royalties and all this stuff in a certain sense that we were just never going to, that the publisher was just not going to pay. It had to be something where the people just wanted it done and thought it might be good without having to get a lot of money for it right away. So I just dropped Glenn a line, was his address in Pasadena, Texas, same as then in 1969 as it is now. And Glenn was interested. He had the rights to sell the rights to Conan and to the Robert E. Howard stories, if not the ones that DeCamp and Carter and others had been associated with. So we struck a deal. I was authorized to give a very small amount of money, which I just shouldn't reveal; it would be embarrassing anyway, per issue and so forth. And I actually offered $50 a page or $50 a book or something, a little small sum more than I was authorized to. So that's how I ended up writing Conan, because I wasn't planning on doing it. But if I gave it to someone else, and the publisher remembered how much he authorized me to offer per issue, and remembered that I had offered $50, that this was $50 more, he was liable to be upset. He was not known to be a generous man in certain ways, like many publishers who would come out of the pulp magazines, and comics for that matter. So I decided I'd write the first couple of issues and try to sneak it in there, because then, if there was any problem, at least I could take it off my own rate and write a couple of free pages or something. I don't know what rate I was getting, but it was enough that would have added up to a couple of pages probably. And so that was it, basically. And the next thing you know, I found myself writing 115 issues in a row of Conan, and only left because I left Marvel entirely. The couple of years of the newspaper strip, almost all of the last 2 weeks. I would have continued that, but even after I left Marvel, but the editor-in-chief wouldn't let me continue that if I was leaving the company of the comics. The first 60 issues of Savage Sword, the first 8 of King Conan, which later became Conan the King, and a bunch of assorted specials, some 5,000 or 6,000 pages, plus starting Kull and the Red Sonja characters.
The extra cost meant, however, that Marvel could not budget for John Buscema, Thomas's first choice. Serendipitously, this opened the door to Barry Windsor Smith. Buscema said in a 1994 interview, "I was approached by Roy Thomas with a project to do Conan. He mailed a couple of the paperbacks to me and I read them. And I loved them. I told Roy, this is what I want. Something that I can really sink my teeth into." At the time, Marvel was owned by Martin Goodman, and he felt my rate was too high to take a gamble with on some kind of a new project. It wasn't a superhero or anything that had been done before. The closest thing to that would have been Tarzan. Anyway, he had no confidence in spending too much time on the book. And that's where Barry Smith came in. He was very cheap. I know what he got paid, and I'd be embarrassed to tell you how much it was because I'd be embarrassed for Marvel. Comics historian Les Daniels noted that Conan the Barbarian was something of a gamble for Marvel. The series contained the usual elements of action and fantasy, to be sure, but it was set in a past that had no relation to the Marvel Universe, and it featured a hero who possessed no magical powers, little humor, and comparatively few moral principles. Marvel initially published Conan every 2 months. After sales of #1 were strong, Marvel quickly made the title monthly, but sales dropped with each additional issue. Stan Lee decided to cancel the comic with #7, not only because of the weak sales, but to use Smith on more popular comics. Thomas argued against this decision, and Lee relented, although the book became bi-monthly again with #14. But by #20, Conan became monthly because of rising sales, and the comic became one of Marvel's most popular in the 1970s. Elric of Melniboné first appeared in comics in Conan the Barbarian issues #14 through 15, 1972. The comics were written by Thomas and illustrated by Windsor Smith, based on a story plotted by Michael Moorcock and James Cawthorne. Red Sonja was introduced in issue #23. That was in 1973. The highly successful Conan the Barbarian series spawned the more adult black and white Savage Sword of Conan in 1974. Published as part of Marvel's line of black and white magazines, written by Thomas with most art by John Buscema or Alfredo Alcala. Savage Sword of Conan soon became one of the most popular comic series of the 1970s and is now considered a cult classic. The Marvel Conan stories were also adapted as a newspaper comic strip, which appeared daily and Sunday from September 4th, 1978 to April 12th, 1981. Originally written by Thomas and illustrated by John Buscema, the strip was continued by several different Marvel artists and writers. Marvel ceased publishing all Conan titles in 2000. In 2003, Dark Horse Comics acquired the license to publish the character. From 1970 to 1993, Marvel published 275 issues of Conan the Barbarian. The Cimmerian also appeared in the first 5 issues of Savage Tales, 12 annuals, 5 giant-size issues, 235 black and white Savage Sword of Conan magazines, 55 issues of King Conan, 14 reboot issues called Conan the Adventurer, 10 issues of Conan the Savage, and 11 issues of Conan. Roy Thomas had Barry Windsor Smith provide art for a Sword and Sorcery story, Star the Slayer, in Chamber of Darkness number 4, April of 1970. This is how he got started on the issue. Soon afterwards, Thomas offered Windsor Smith the job as a penciler for Marvel's adaptation of Conan, starting with Conan the Barbarian number 1 in October of 1970. Comics historian Les Daniels notes that Windsor Smith's initial efforts were slightly sketchy, but his technique progressed by leaps and bounds within a few months. He had achieved a style never seen in comics before. During his run on Conan the Barbarian, Windsor Smith was involved in the writings as well. He and writer Roy Thomas adapted a number of Howard short stories, the aforementioned Frost Giant's Daughter, Tower of the Elephant, Rogues in the House, and Red Nails, as well as the art and story contributions. Windsor Smith provided the covers for most issues. They worked on original adventures and characters based on R.E. Howard's characters, most notably the flame-haired warrior woman, Red Sonja, loosely based on a character from one of Howard's non-Conan stories, who has now become a major comics character in her own right. In the Song of Red Sonja in Conan the Barbarian number 24 from 1973, Windsor Smith's last issue of the title. By then, he had worked on 21 of the first 24 issues of the series, missing only issues number 17 and number 18 and number 22, which was a reprint issue number 1. Windsor Smith would later say that the reason he missed those issues was because he had quit the series a number of times, as he was dissatisfied with the work and how comics business worked, rather than the deadline problems Marvel quoted. In 2010, Comics Bulletin ranked Thomas and Windsor Smith's work on Conan the Barbarian 7th on its list of top 10 1970s Marvels. Then came Big John Buscema. He took over the title with the next issue and drew, this is from Salute Mag, even when drawing the powerful Conan, whose look had already been defined for many fans by the renowned painter and fantasy artist Frank Frazetta, Buscema gave the character an aesthetic and lithe grace, despite his bulk. This resonated with readers. Buscema's celebrated work on the character was so popular it had a role in convincing producers to greenlight the first Conan film, which debuted in 1982. Naturally, Buscema penciled and inked the beautiful comic adaptation of this movie. Buscema began penciling Conan the Barbarian with number 25 in April of 1973. Following Barry Smith's celebrated run and debuted as the Conan artist of the black and white comics magazine Omnibus, Savage Sword of Conan with issue number 1. That was August of 1974. He would eventually contribute to more than 100 issues of each title, giving him one of the most prolific runs for an artist on a single character. He additionally drew the Conan Sunday and daily syndicated newspaper comic strips upon its premiere in 1978. Then we come to Dark Horse's run on the character. 7 major comic series published by Dark Horse Comics. The first series, titled simply Conan, ran for 50 issues from 2004 to 2008. The second, titled Conan the Cimmerian, began publication in 2008 and lasted 25 issues until 2010. The third series, titled Conan, Road of Kings, started publishing in December 2010 and ended in January 2012 after 12 issues. A fourth series, titled Conan the Barbarian, continuing from Road of Kings, lasted 25 issues from February 2012 to March of 2014. A fifth series, titled Conan the Avenger, started publishing in April 2014 and ended in April 2016 after 25 issues. A sixth and final series titled Conan the Slayer lasted 12 issues from July 2016 to August of 2017. Another series titled King Conan, which takes place during Conan's time as king, ran in parallel and launched in February 2011. That series concluded in 2016 with 24 issues. Dark Horse has also published half a dozen one-shots and almost a dozen miniseries. Dark Horse Comics began their take on Conan in 2003 with the one-shot prologue, Conan Number 0, Conan the Legend. Conan the Cimmerian, Conan Road of Kings, and Conan the Barbarian series presents a fresh interpretation, incorporating both new material and adaptations of stories by Robert E. Howard. With no other connection to many Marvel Comics series or other post-Howard material, an ongoing dialogue between two characters, the Prince and the Wazir, living in the aged century in Conan's future, is often used as a framing device for the stories. Each issue also contains the adventures of Two Gun Bob, true stories from the life of Robert E. Howard by Jim and Ruth Keegan. Writers for Dark Horse's Conan included Kurt Busiek, Timothy Truman, and Paul Lee. Artists included Harry Nord, Thomas Yates, Eric Powell, Thomas Girelli, and Tom Mandrake. The series won many awards, including 4 Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards, which also included Best Single Issue or One-Shot Conan No. 0, The Legend, 4 Eagle Awards, including Favorite New Comic, Conan. The second run, Conan the Cimmerian, included stories by Timothy Truman and art from Thomas Giarello, Richard Corbin, Joe Kubert, and Paul Lee. The third series included stories from Roy Thomas with art from Mike Hawthorne and Dan Panosian. The fourth series included stories by Brian Wood with art from Becky Clonan, James Harron, Vasilis Lolos, Declan Shalvey, Mirko Kloak, Andrea Moody, David Gianfilis, Paul Azaceta, Riccardo Bercelli. Conan the Avenger was Dark Horse Comics' 5th series with Fred Van Lente as the writer, Daryl Mandrake, Brian Chung-Gill, Villanova, Eric Powell, Brian Ching, Jason Felix, Paul Renaud, Jose Lewis, Andy Owens, and Simon Bisley. Conan the Slayer was Dark Horse Comics' 6th and final series about Conan, with Cullen Bunn as the writer. There were also many one-shots and comic book crossovers with the likes of Wonder Woman and Red Sonja. From Sci-Fi Wire, Matthew Jackson. Earlier this year, we learned that Conan the Barbarian would be returning to Marvel Comics after years of stories published by Dark Horse. Now Marvel has revealed the creative team that will guide the Cimmerian in its new adventures. The publisher announced Friday that Conan the Barbarian No. 1, a new ongoing series starring the legendary fantasy hero created by Robert E. Howard, will be brought to us in January by the team of writer Jason Aaron, artist Mohamed Asrar, cover artist Asad Ribic, and colorist Matt Wilson. That's an all-star lineup for one of the most beloved genre characters of all time. Aaron and Asrar in particular credit Conan as a figure responsible for jump-starting their prospective imaginations. Now let's look at the history of Conan on the silver screen, both in movies and TV, live action and animation. The very first Conan cinematic project was planned by Edward Summer. Summer envisioned a series of Conan films much like the James Bond franchise. He outlined 6 stories for this film series, but none were ever made. An original screenplay by Summer and Roy Thomas was written, but their lore authentic screen story was never filmed. However, the resulting film, Conan the Barbarian, from 1982, was a combination of director John Milius ideas and plots from Conan stories, also written by Howard's successors, notably Lynn Carter and L. Frank DeCamp. The addition of Nietzschean motto and Conan's life philosophy were crucial for bringing the spirit of Howard's literature to the screen. The film was followed by a less popular sequel, Conan the Destroyer, in 1984. This sequel was a more typical fantasy genre film and even less faithful to Howard's Conan stories, being just a picturesque story of an assorted bunch of adventurers. The third film in the Conan trilogy was planned for 1987 to be titled Conan the Conqueror. The director was to be either Guy Hamilton or John Guillermin. Since Arnold Schwarzenegger was committed to the film Predator and De Laurentiis' contract with the star had expired, after his obligation to Red Sonja and Raw Deal, he wasn't keen to negotiate a new one. Thus, the third Conan film sank into development hell. The script was eventually turned into Kull the Conqueror, starring the Hercules actor Kevin Sorbo. There were rumors in the late 1990s of another Conan sequel, a story about an older Conan titled Conan the King, Crown of Iron. But Schwarzenegger's election in 2003 as governor of California ended this project. Warner Brothers spent 7 years trying to get the project off the ground. However, in June 2007, the rights reverted to Paradox Entertainment, though all drafts made under Warner remained with them. In August of 2007, it was announced that Millennium Films had acquired the rights to the project. Production was aimed for a spring 2006 start, with the intention of having stories more faithful to the Robert E. Howard creation. In June of 2009, Millennium hired Marcus Nispel to direct. In January of 2010, Jason Momoa was selected for the role of Conan. The film was released in August 2011 and met poor critical reviews and box office results. The Legend of Conan. In 2012, producers Chris Morgan and Frederick Malmberg announced plans for a sequel to the 1982 Conan the Barbarian, titled The Legend of Conan, with Arnold Schwarzenegger reprising his role as Conan. A year later, Dateline reported that Andrea Berloff would write the script. Years passed since the initial announcement, as Schwarzenegger worked on other films. But as late as 2016, Schwarzenegger affirmed his enthusiasm for making the film and saying, "Interest is high, but we're not rushing." The script was finished, and Schwarzenegger and Morgan were meeting with possible directors. In April of 2017, producer Chris Morgan stated that Universal had dropped the project, although there was a possibility of a TV show. The story of the film was supposed to be set 30 years after the first, with some inspiration from Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. And now we come to television. There have been 3 television series related to Conan. Conan the Adventurer is an animated television series produced by Jetlag Productions and Sunbow Productions that debuted on October 1st of 1992. It ran for 64 episodes, exactly 2 years later on October 1st, 1994. The series involved Conan chasing serpent men across the world in an attempt to release his parents from eternal imprisonment as living statues. Conan the Young Warriors is an animated television series that premiered in 1994 and ran for 13 episodes. DIC Entertainment produced the show, and CBS aired the series as a spin-off to the previous animated series. This cartoon took place after the finale of Conan the Adventurer, with Wrath Ammon vanquished and Conan's family returned to life from living stone. Conan soon finds that the family of one of his friends are being turned into wolves by an evil sorceress, and he must train 3 warriors in order to aid him in rescuing them. Conan the Adventurer is a live-action television series that premiered on September 22, 1997 and ran for 22 episodes. It starred German bodybuilder Rolf Mahler as Conan and Danny Woodburn as his sidekick Otley. The storyline was quite different from the Conan lore of Howard. In this adaptation, Conan is a pleasant and jovial person. Also in this version, Conan is not a loner, but one member of a merry band of adventurers. In February of 2018, Deadline reported that a new Conan TV series was in the works at Amazon Prime, with Ryan Condal, Miguel Sapochnik, Warren Littlefield, Pathfinder Media, and Endeavor Content working on the project. And that brings us to the end of another broadcast. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'm Kevin Given for Comics Let's Talk. If you like what you heard, if you love comic books, you're going to subscribe to my channel. Just hit that little red subscribe button, and we'll get different shows for you every week, or sometimes bi-weekly, depending on my schedule. We'll have at least 2 or 3 shows a month for you, and we'll be talking about comic books and all things comic book related. Until next week, this is Kevin Given saying, have a good day, and keep reading those comics.